My name is James, and I am 27 years old. Hunting has been part of my life for years, not because I enjoyed killing animals, but because life has a way of pushing people toward whatever keeps food on the table. My small business had been struggling for months, bills kept piling up, and my landlord had already reminded me twice that rent was overdue. Whenever things became difficult, I would head into the forest with my traps, because deer meat always sold well, and every now and then I would catch something valuable enough to keep me afloat. I knew those woods better than most people in town. I'd walked almost every trail, crossed every creek, and memorized every large rock and fallen tree. That was exactly why I never imagined something inside those woods could still surprise me. Looking back now, I wish I had stayed home that night, because what happened out there was not some bloody attack or some dramatic fight for survival. It became something much worse. It left me with a fear that still follows me years later every single time darkness falls. It was around 9 that evening when I entered the forest with my backpack, flashlight, hunting knife, and enough supplies to last the night if something delayed me. I had set 6 traps the previous day, spacing each one carefully because placing them too close together reduced the chances of catching anything. The last trap was always the furthest one because that area had the highest concentration of deer. Unfortunately, it also bordered a restricted section of the forest where hunters were strongly advised never to go. Everyone in town knew why. The land beyond that point sloped sharply toward a massive cliff covered with loose rocks and unstable ground. Several hunters had slipped over the years. Some survived with broken bones, while others never returned at all. Rangers eventually placed warning signs around the area, and most experienced hunters respected those boundaries. I always did too. I had no intention of becoming another name people whispered about at the local bar. My first trap was exactly where I left it. As soon as I reached it, I knew I had wasted the trip because it had not even been triggered. 24 hours had passed and not a single animal had stepped into it. I crouched beside it, inspected the mechanism, reset it, and sighed to myself. I remember quietly muttering that maybe my luck would improve further in because there were still 5 traps left. 8 minutes later, I reached the second location, after weaving between thick trees and patches of brush. This one had been triggered, and for a brief second I felt hopeful, until I pushed through the bushes and saw a rabbit hanging there. I just stood staring at it with disappointment. Rabbits barely sold for anything. I remember shaking my head and saying under my breath that this would not even cover a fraction of my rent. I removed it anyway because wasted money was still money. The third trap was even more discouraging. Instead of another deer, I found a grass cutter struggling weakly against the wire. It was alive, but exhausted. I sighed again because its market value was even lower than the rabbit. I released it from its suffering as quickly as I could and packed it away, but my mood continued sinking. The deeper I walked into those woods, the more I kept reminding myself that the better catches usually came from the traps closest to the restricted area. Most hunters avoided that section because of the dangerous terrain, which meant the animals there lived with far less disturbance. That was always my strategy. I accepted a little extra risk in exchange for better hunting opportunities, but I never crossed into the forbidden section itself. The fourth trap had absolutely nothing. The wire remained perfectly set as though no animal had even passed nearby. The fifth trap gave me exactly the same result. At that point, frustration started replacing hope. I remember laughing to myself because sometimes that is all you can do when life refuses to cooperate. I kept walking until I finally reached my 6th and final trap, the one nearest the restricted zone. At first, my flashlight caught the outline of a deer lying on the ground, and my heart immediately lifted. I hurried toward it thinking the entire trip had finally paid off. Then I reached it and realized it was only a young deer. It was nowhere near full grown. Nobody paid good money for one that small. I stood there for several seconds staring at it, wondering how everything had gone wrong in a single night. I'd spent hours hiking through the forest only to return with catches worth almost nothing. My business was failing, rent was overdue, and now even hunting had betrayed me. I found myself staring toward the warning signs marking the forbidden hunting zone. The flashlight illuminated only the first few trees beyond them, while everything deeper disappeared into complete darkness. I knew I should turn around immediately, but desperation has a dangerous way of convincing people they are still making reasonable decisions. I told myself I was not actually entering the forbidden zone. I would only place one additional trap a few steps before the steep slope leading toward the cliff. Just one trap. That was all. If it caught something valuable, maybe the trip would not be a complete failure after all. I carefully walked forward until I found what looked like a promising animal trail, secured the trap, and quickly stepped back toward safer ground. By the time I finished, I checked my watch and realized it was already 1 a.m. Walking all the way back through the forest in complete darkness with a flashlight that was already losing power seemed even more dangerous than spending a few hours there. I decided to camp beside a cluster of large rocks near the edge of the restricted area. I pitched my small tent, built no fire because I did not want unnecessary attention from animals, ate a quick snack, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I could not have been asleep for more than an hour when a distant cry pulled me awake. At first, it sounded almost like a wolf somewhere deep in the forest. That did not worry me because wolves occasionally pass through those woods without bothering hunters. I stayed inside my sleeping bag, listened for another minute, and almost convinced myself to ignore it. Then the cry came again. This time it was louder. It echoed strangely between the trees, lingering longer than any animal sound I had ever heard before. Something about it made every hair on my body stand up. I slowly sat upright inside the tent, careful not to make unnecessary noise. I had no intention of rushing outside because I was not foolish enough to investigate strange noises in the middle of the night. Instead, I reached for the zipper and opened it only enough to create a narrow gap barely wider than 2 fingers. I pressed one eye against the opening and scanned the darkness. At first, I saw nothing except trees swaying gently in the wind. I slowly moved my head from side to side, searching for movement, and that was when I noticed something standing near the edge of the restricted zone exactly where I had placed my last trap. For a second, my brain refused to understand what I was looking at. It stood upright like a person, but everything else about it looked wrong. Its legs were unnaturally long, almost bending in ways they should not. Its arms hung so low they nearly touched the ground. Its eyes reflected my fading flashlight with an unnatural brightness that looked almost white, instead of the usual yellow glow animals produce at night. The creature lowered its head and tore into the deer caught inside my trap with movements that were disturbingly calm. It was not eating like a wild animal. It looked almost deliberate, almost careful, as though it understood exactly what it was doing. I completely forgot to breathe. Every instinct screamed at me not to move. My heart pounded so hard I became terrified it would somehow hear it from outside. Then I made the stupidest mistake of my life. While trying to shift my weight, my foot accidentally struck my flashlight lying beside my sleeping bag. It rolled across the floor of the tent and hit one of the metal support poles with a sharp clink that sounded unbelievably loud in the silence. The creature stopped eating instantly. Its head snapped toward my tent so fast that I physically flinched. It remained perfectly still for several seconds, staring directly at me even though the zipper opening was barely visible. I pressed my hand over my mouth without even thinking, terrified that the sound of my breathing alone might give me away. The creature slowly tilted its head from one side to the other, as if listening. It took one slow step toward my tent, then another, before suddenly stopping again. After what felt like forever, it turned back toward the trapped deer and continued feeding as though nothing had happened. I remained frozen exactly where I was, barely daring to blink. Not long afterward, the crying sound returned. It came from the creature itself. I know that because I watched its head lift toward the sky every single time the sound echoed through the forest. It was impossible to describe properly. It did not sound completely human or completely animal. It carried something that felt painfully wrong, almost as though several different voices were layered together into one impossible cry. Sometimes it sounded close enough to touch, then moments later it felt impossibly distant, even though I could still see the creature standing in the same place. That continued for what felt like an hour. I never once moved from where I sat. My legs became numb, my back ached, and my mouth felt so dry I thought I might choke if I swallowed. Eventually, the cries stopped completely. The creature simply walked into the darkness beyond the restricted zone, until even its glowing eyes disappeared among the trees. I remained awake until sunrise because there was no chance I was closing my eyes after witnessing something like that. The very moment daylight reached the forest floor, I packed my tent as quickly as my shaking hands would allow. I did not bother collecting the trap near the forbidden zone. I did not even look in its direction again. Whatever money I had lost meant absolutely nothing compared to staying alive. I threw my backpack over my shoulder and practically ran through the forest without stopping until I reached the safer hunting trails. When I finally returned to town, I told several of my friends exactly what had happened. Most of them laughed at first, thinking exhaustion had caused me to imagine things, but I did not care whether they believed me or not. I knew what I had seen. From that day forward, I never hunted beyond the safe zone again. Even now, years later, I still avoid that part of the forest completely. My name is Abignel. This is not a story about me. It is about my younger brother, and it is something I still struggle to explain even after all these years. I grew up in a small village surrounded by thick woods that everyone respected, but very few people willingly entered after sunset. My parents spent most of their time working, so I was the one who looked after my little brother, who was only 9 years old. We spent almost every day together whenever I was not helping around the house or running errands in the village. He was energetic, always laughing, always finding new friends to play with. Looking back now, I sometimes wish I had forced him to stay home that day, because everything that happened afterward began with what should have been an ordinary evening. I had gone to the market that afternoon to buy a few things my mother needed before she returned from work. By the time I finished and walked home, the sun was already beginning to disappear behind the trees. It was around 6 in the evening when I reached our house. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything felt. Normally my brother would come running toward me asking what I had brought back, or telling me about whatever game he had been playing with the neighborhood children, but the yard was empty. I assumed he was still outside because children often stayed out a little later than they were supposed to, especially when they were having fun. I put the groceries inside and waited for a few minutes without thinking much about it. Then someone knocked on the front door. When I opened it, I found 2 of our neighbors standing there with expressions that immediately made my stomach tighten. One of them asked if I had seen his daughter because she had not returned home since the afternoon. Before I could answer, the other man stepped forward and said his son was missing too. He explained that the children had all been playing together earlier that day, but now nobody knew where they had gone. My heart immediately began pounding. I told them my brother had not returned either because I assumed he was still with their children. The moment those words left my mouth, the fear on their faces became impossible to hide. Nobody spoke for a few seconds because we all understood the same terrible possibility at exactly the same time. I suggested we search the village immediately before darkness completely settled in. I quickly changed my clothes, grabbed the brightest flashlight we had, and followed the 2 parents outside. We searched every street, every open field, every place where children usually gathered after school. We called their names until our voices became hoarse, but nobody answered. After searching for nearly an hour, we started knocking on doors, asking every child we could find whether they had seen the 3 of them. The first child shook his head. The second child said he had not seen them since the afternoon. At the 4th house, we finally got an answer that froze every one of us where we stood. A young boy quietly told us he had seen the 3 children walking toward the woods shortly before sunset. None of them had mentioned they were going there, and every child in the village knew they were never supposed to enter those woods alone. Without wasting another second, we hurried toward the forest entrance carrying our flashlights. The air became colder the moment we stepped beneath the trees. We shouted their names again and again while our flashlight beams searched every path, every bush, and every shadow around us. The forest remained strangely silent until several minutes later when one of the fathers suddenly stopped walking and pointed ahead. Standing in the darkness were 3 small figures with their backs turned toward us. They were completely still. My brother was standing beside the other 2 children exactly as if they had been waiting for us all along. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I almost laughed. I called my brother's name and hurried toward him, already preparing to scold him for frightening everyone. The other parents rushed toward their own children with the same mixture of anger and relief. None of the children answered us. They simply remained standing there without moving. As I reached my brother and gently grabbed his shoulder, I noticed something dark covering both of his hands. My flashlight revealed thick black blood smeared across his fingers and wrists. The other children looked exactly the same. At their feet lay several dead crows with their feathers ripped away and their bodies torn apart so violently that I could barely recognize them as birds anymore. At that exact moment, I heard loud cawing above us. I lifted my flashlight toward the sky and saw dozens of black crows circling over the trees, flying round and round while screaming into the darkness. It looked exactly like the kind of warning people describe in old stories, the moment before something terrible reveals itself. I demanded to know what my brother had been doing. The other parents began shouting at their own children, grabbing them by their shoulders and even striking them in frustration. For several uncomfortable seconds, none of the children reacted. That silence felt completely wrong because my brother had never ignored me before. Finally, he slowly turned his head and apologized in a calm voice, saying they had wandered too far into the forest and became lost. The other two children quietly repeated the same explanation. We accepted it because they were only children, and none of us imagined they could be hiding something far worse than getting lost. Looking back now, believing them was the greatest mistake any of us ever made. Life appeared to return to normal after that night, but it only took a few days before I realized my brother was no longer behaving like himself. The cheerful little boy I had grown up protecting slowly disappeared without anyone noticing at first. Every single night I would wake up and find him standing silently beside my bed, staring down at me without blinking. The first time it happened, I nearly screamed because I thought someone had broken into the house. When I called his name, he quietly climbed back into bed without saying a word. I convinced myself he was sleepwalking because I desperately wanted a simple explanation. I had no idea that whatever walked out of those woods with us was no longer completely my brother. Strange things began happening throughout the village soon afterward. Healthy animals started dying for no reason. Chickens, goats, and even dogs were found dead with no visible injuries. Crops that had been growing perfectly well suddenly withered and turned brown within days. My brother stopped laughing completely. He preferred sitting alone for hours, staring into empty space as if listening to voices nobody else could hear. Sometimes I caught him digging his fingernails into his own skin until blood ran down his hands, yet he never reacted as though he felt pain. He barely touched the food we prepared for him. Then one evening I stepped outside after hearing strange sounds behind our house and found him crouched beside one of our chickens. He was tearing pieces of raw flesh from its body with his teeth, while blood dripped from his mouth. When he looked up at me, his eyes showed no fear, no shame, and no recognition. That was the exact moment I accepted the horrifying truth that the child standing before me was not the brother I had known all my life. The other two families suffered even more than mine. One of the children's mothers suddenly became sick with an illness no healer could identify, and she died only a short time later despite every effort to save her. The other child's father watched his entire business collapse without explanation. Every opportunity disappeared almost overnight until he was left with nothing. It felt as though a curse had settled over everyone connected to those three children. People whispered constantly about evil spirits and forbidden places deep inside the forest. As the strange events spread through the village, even the village priest became convinced that something unnatural had returned with the children that night. He organized a ritual involving prayers, sacred herbs, and ancient traditions that had not been performed for many years. The entire village gathered while the three children were brought before him. I will never forget the sounds that came from my brother during that ritual, because they did not sound human. Eventually, everything became quiet, and when he finally looked at me again, I recognized the fear in his eyes for the first time since we found him in the woods. The priest declared that whatever had possessed the children was gone. My brother slowly returned to himself, but he was never truly the same again. The same was true for the other two children. They survived, yet each of them carried something invisible that never completely left them. I survived as well, and sometimes I believe the only reason I escaped whatever happened was because somewhere inside all that darkness my brother was still fighting to protect me. I feel sorry for the other two children more than anyone because they paid a far greater price than we did. Not long after everything finally settled down, my family packed our belongings and left that village forever. None of us wanted to remain anywhere near those woods again, and none of us wanted to risk discovering what might still be waiting there for anyone foolish enough to wander inside. My name is Caleb. I was 21 years old when this happened, and before anyone decides I am making it up, I wish they understood how badly I wish none of it had ever happened. I grew up in a little town called Kite. Fewer than 1,000 people live there. It was one of those forgotten places where technology always seemed years behind everyone else, and every family knew each other by name. There was only one thing everyone agreed on without question. Nobody entered the old forest west of town. The adults had repeated that warning since we were children. They never explained much beyond saying that something terrible happened there hundreds of years ago, and that the woods were cursed long before any of us were born. By the time we became teenagers, the warning sounded more like an old song we had heard too many times. We stopped taking it seriously because nothing had ever happened to any of us. That afternoon, I was coming home from college with 5 friends after classes ended. Our town was small, but we still had a community college nearby. Martin walked beside Catherine because they had been dating for almost a year. Brian was next to me while Thomas and Kimmy followed behind us. We were laughing about our lecturers and complaining about assignments as we walked the familiar road back toward town. Everything felt normal until the old forest appeared ahead of us. It was about 30 minutes from town, standing there like a wall of black trees that blocked the evening sunlight. Catherine looked toward the trees and started talking about how ridiculous the adults sounded every time they warned people to stay away. She kept saying the older generation believed anything they heard and that nobody had ever actually seen a monster. Martin tried changing the subject because even he did not like talking about the forest. The rest of us agreed that there was no point discussing it, but Catherine would not stop. She kept teasing Martin, asking if he was actually scared of a few trees. She laughed at him until his face changed. Martin always hated looking weak in front of people, especially in front of her. Before any of us realized what he was doing, he stepped off the road and started walking toward the forest. We all tried stopping him, but he brushed us off with a smile that made him look far more confident than he actually was. None of us wanted to let him disappear into those woods alone, so we followed him, believing we would drag him back out after proving there was nothing inside. The moment we crossed beneath the trees, everything changed. The air became colder than it had any right to be. The birds vanished. Even the insects stopped making noise. Our footsteps sounded strangely loud against the dead leaves covering the ground. The deeper we walked, the darker everything became, despite the sun still being high enough that there should have been plenty of light. Martin kept pretending everything was fine, but even he stopped talking after a while. We walked for what felt like 10 minutes before Brian quietly pointed out something that made all of us stop. The path behind us was gone. There was no trail leading back toward the road. It had disappeared completely beneath roots and thick bushes that had not been there before. At first we thought we had simply taken a wrong turn. We tried walking back the way we came, but every direction looked exactly the same. The trees were impossibly tall, their trunks twisted into shapes that almost looked human. Kimmy started crying because she insisted that tree with the split trunk had already been passed twice. Thomas argued with her until he noticed the same broken branch hanging over us for the third time. We were walking in circles without realizing it. Panic slowly replaced confidence. Even Catherine stopped pretending the stories were nonsense. Then we heard something moving. It was not footsteps. It sounded like several massive bodies dragging themselves through wet leaves at the same time. The noise circled us without ever getting closer. We could hear branches snapping high above us, even though nothing should have been heavy enough to move through the tops of those trees. Martin picked up a thick branch and told us to stay close. I remember looking at his face and realizing he no longer believed his own bravery. The smell reached us before the creature did. It smelled like rotten meat left beneath the sun for weeks. My stomach turned so violently that I nearly vomited. Brian covered his nose while Thomas whispered that something was watching us. Before anyone could answer, Martin disappeared. He did not run. He did not scream first. Something burst from the darkness so quickly that I barely saw it. 1 second Martin was standing beside Catherine, and the next he was flying through the air. His body slammed against a tree hard enough to split the bark. Every bone in his body seemed to break at once. Before he could even cry out, a massive claw closed around his head. I heard his skull crack like dry wood before the rest of him collapsed into a shapeless pile. The creature lowered its face and bit into his chest, tearing out flesh with one violent jerk while blood sprayed across the surrounding trees. Catherine screamed louder than I thought any human being could. We all started running without even looking back. Behind us came a sound I will never forget. It was chewing, slow, wet chewing, as if whatever had killed Martin wanted us to hear every bite. We ran until our lungs burned, but the forest refused to end. Every path twisted back into another wall of trees. Every direction looked identical. Catherine kept calling Martin's name between sobs, even though we all knew there was nothing left to answer. Then she suddenly stopped running. She was staring ahead with wide eyes. I followed her gaze and saw Martin standing between the trees. At least I thought it was Martin. His body was bent in impossible directions. Half his face was missing, exposing broken teeth and shattered bone. His arms hung backward while blood dripped steadily onto the ground. He smiled at us with what remained of his mouth. Before any of us could react, the real creature unfolded itself from behind him. It was so tall its head disappeared into the branches. Its body looked stitched together from different animals that should never have existed. Its skin was gray and stretched tightly over long ribs. 4 arms ended in claws longer than kitchen knives. Its face had no eyes. Only a mouth had opened from the top of its head to the bottom of its neck, filled with rows of crooked teeth that kept moving as though they were alive. Thomas froze. The creature reached him before any of us could. One claw pierced straight through his stomach and lifted him into the air. He screamed until another arm grabbed one of his legs and pulled. His body tore apart with a sound that still wakes me in the middle of the night. His spine snapped. His ribs burst through his skin. Half of him landed beside us while the other half remained hanging from the creature's claws. It lowered its head and swallowed him piece by piece. Kimmy completely lost control. She ran in the opposite direction without thinking. Brian chased after her while Catherine and I followed behind. We could hear the creature moving somewhere above us instead of on the ground. Every few seconds, blood splashed onto the leaves around us even though nothing was visible overhead. Kimmy suddenly disappeared with a scream. The ground beneath her had opened. She fell into a pit filled with old bones. Before we could reach her, dozens of pale arms climbed out of the darkness beneath the bones. They grabbed her legs, her hair, and her face. She begged us to help, but there were too many of them. They dragged her downward while she clawed desperately at the edge. I watched her fingernails tear completely off as she tried holding on. Her screams slowly turned into choking sounds before everything became silent. There were only 3 of us left. Catherine had completely broken down. She kept saying none of this was real. She stumbled through the trees without paying attention until the creature landed directly in front of her. It moved faster than anything that large should have been able to move. One claw sliced through both her legs. She collapsed instantly. Instead of killing her immediately, it slowly pulled her across the ground while she screamed and reached toward us. Her fingers dug long trails into the dirt before the monster bit into her shoulder and ripped her arm completely off. Brian tried running toward her, but I grabbed him because there was nothing either of us could do. The last thing I heard from Catherine was a scream that suddenly stopped the moment the creature crushed her skull between its jaws. Brian and I ran until our bodies could barely move. We finally reached what looked like the edge of the forest. I could see light beyond the trees. I believed we had made it. Then the creature landed in front of us again. It had been playing with us the entire time. Brian shoved me aside just as one of its claws came down. Instead of killing me, it ripped my left arm completely off. I did not even feel pain at first. I simply looked down and saw blood pouring from an empty shoulder. Seconds later, the pain hit so hard that I collapsed. While I was trying to stand, another claw caught the side of my face. My left eye disappeared in a burst of blood so sudden that the world became half dark. Brian dragged me to my feet and kept telling me we had to keep moving because the light was real this time. He could barely walk himself after twisting his ankle earlier. Every few steps he stumbled. Every stumble made the creature come a little closer. That was when I realized something horrible. It wanted one of us to survive. It wanted the other one to watch. Brian looked at me and begged me not to leave him because he could not run anymore. I wish I could tell you I stayed. I wish I could tell you I fought beside him until the end, but fear changes people. I shoved him backward as hard as I could and kept running. I heard him fall. I heard him screaming my name. I heard the creature reach him. His screams lasted longer than anyone else's because the monster made sure I heard every second of them. I kept running with one arm, one eye, and more blood leaving my body than I thought a person could lose. I no longer cared where I was going. I only wanted to keep moving. Then I saw dozens of lights flickering through the trees ahead. At first, I thought the forest was trying to trick me again, but then I heard familiar voices calling our names. The adults from town had come looking for us with torches. I stumbled toward them before collapsing face first onto the ground, and that was the moment I finally crossed out of the cursed forest.